In modern times, pollution, deforestation, poaching, introduced pests, and many other threats have led many species to the brink of extinction, or in some cases, complete extinction. When discussing the real and potential extinction of certain animal species, we often take it for granted that extinction is a bad and undesirable thing. But is it really? Here I want to improve our understandings of whether or not we should oppose the extinction of animal species, and why. There is some irony in the fact that we get in a big fuss about extinction, which we view as some kind of egregious moral crime, when we sit perfectly content as billions of animals are treated with massive cruelty to feed us. I feel like most of us just assume extinction is bad because everyone else seems to think so. It is just intuitively assumed that extinction is bad and undesirable. It is just intuitively assumed that extinction is something to be opposed. Perhaps this is due to an association with death, which we have through natural selection evolved to fear. But that obviously isn't a completely adequate explanation, because most people are fine with hunting and farming that kills. Perhaps the extinction of a species seems bad because it is eternal non-existence, and the idea of something being gone forever is slightly disturbing, particularly to those who take comfort in continuity. Today I want to talk about extinction and some of the main arguments for the extinction of a species being bad. I will also talk about an argument for the desirability of extinction. Do note that there are arguments that could be offered here for either side, which I have almost certainly missed. If you like, try to think of other arguments for either side, and feel free to leave them in the comments. Let's begin with some of the main arguments for the idea that the extinction of a species is bad and undesirable. The first, and certainly the strongest argument against letting species go extinct, concerns biodiversity and homeostasis. If certain species become very rare or go extinct, the whole ecosystem could be massively destabilized. This is not true for every creature, but it is for some. Bees, for example, are a creature where these concerns are very relevant. The issue with the ecosystem destabilizing is that this could lead to us losing access to all manner of resources. When it comes to species which are vital for propping up pieces of the ecosystem which we benefit massively off of, this argument concerning biodiversity and homeostasis is a very good reason for us to get involved and ensure extinction does not occur. If the extinction of some species does occur, it will massively harm our own interests and lead to massive suffering due to the depletion of certain resources. This means it is in our interest to ensure these animals do not go extinct. We must intervene in these cases to prevent extinction. This is a very good argument for caring about the potential extinction of not all animals but a decently large number of them. This argument is good because it highlights the simple fact of reality that certain animals going extinct will massively harm us and lead to great suffering. Therefore, averting the extinction of many species is in our interest because it is in our interest to have a stable ecosystem and consistent access to plentiful resources. This argument doesn't say extinction is inherently bad, but instead that it can be bad and something we should oppose as it could threaten our own well-being. This is the first argument for why we should oppose the extinction of some animals and intervene when necessary. It is a very good argument as well. Now, on to the next one. The suffering involved in extinction. This argument concerns the suffering people cause to animal species through the process of making them extinct. To make something extinct, we normally end up killing it in some way. Normally that killing causes suffering to the animal, and depending on how social the species is, potentially other individuals as well. This causes animals to suffer and can therefore be deemed undesirable and worthy of discouragement on the grounds that it is immoral. What makes causing suffering immoral is complicated. This is not one of my foundations of morality style videos, but I will summarize in brief. Harming animals normalizes violence and cruelty. Harming animals undermines desirable human emotions such as empathy and compassion. Propagating these emotions in others and oneself is in one's interest, as these emotions help to facilitate a good, meaningful life in a kind and caring society. Harming animals damages reciprocal morality by stating that it is okay to hurt others when it is in your interest. And I could go on. The process of extinction often involves suffering, be it harpooned whales, finned sharks, hornless rhinos, or whatever else of the countless examples. This suffering is more than worthy of the label immoral and provides a fairly strong reason to be opposed to species going extinct. Not because extinction is itself inherently bad, but because it normally appears alongside suffering, which is bad. These things overlap, but far from completely. Suffering can exist and be undesirable without any dangers of extinction. Similarly, extinction could potentially occur without such suffering. In many cases, however, extinction does involve suffering, making this argument relevant. The biodiversity and suffering arguments are, in my view, almost certainly the best. They make a fairly solid case that extinction is not inherently undesirable, but quite often undesirable, due to its consequences and/or the suffering that often accompanies it. The next two arguments are, in my view, comparative garbage. I will talk about them anyways because they seem to be quite common. First, we have humanity's interest in keeping interesting species around so we can observe them and admire their various physical features and habits. In other words, we shouldn't make rhinos extinct because they look cool. This is almost certainly the least serious of the four arguments for opposing the extinction of a species. It is a pretty bad argument in my opinion. Observing interesting animals can cause happiness, and this is probably worthy of some consideration, but not as much as the previously mentioned two factors, which are far more important. This argument only defends cool and interesting animals from extinction. One issue with this is that cool and interesting are very subjective measurements. The issue with this is that different people will hold massively different views on what animals we should care about based upon how cool or interesting they find them. The idea that how cool something looks can increase its moral worth can also have some unsavory implications. The logical implication of this argument is that warthogs being extinct is more desirable than rhinos being extinct because rhinos generally are considered to look cooler. I would say most people think rhinos look cooler than warthogs, although warthogs probably have a few fans. This could easily be translated to something along the lines of people widely viewed as attractive have a higher moral worth than people who are less attractive. Do you see the disturbing logical implications this idea could potentially have? Basing moral worth on how nice something looks is a bit dangerous. When applied to humans, it becomes very obvious how undesirable and dangerous such an idea can be. It is immoral for a range of reasons, and sets the scene quite nicely for dehumanization and the undermining of empathy and reciprocity. Would you want someone to prefer you suffer to someone else just because they don't think you look cool enough? I don't think so. This is not a good measurement. Judging animals by their coolness to decide if we oppose their extinction or not is weird. I think the happiness an animal can inspire is potentially worth taking into account, but can also have some disturbing consequences and implications. We need to be careful with this. The idea that not cool animals suffering is excusable, while cool animals suffering is not, is quite unappealing as well. The animals didn't choose their species. It seems weird to derive moral worth from something which doesn't even relate to the animal's ability to suffer. Sentience is a far better foundation of moral categorization than coolness. Coolness does not actually have anything to do with an animal's ability to suffer. Ultimately, I think the argument that extinction is bad because less cool animals is garbage. The two prior arguments are significantly better. Now we come to the final argument for the idea that animals going extinct due to our habits is bad. This argument goes as follows. We should keep out of nature and let it do its thing, free from our intervention. I don't really care for this argument because it doesn't give any convincing reason as to why. A moral question which comes up very rarely, but will quite possibly be an upcoming step in animal rights discussions, is where and when human intervention into nature to lessen suffering is justified. I see no reason why we should stay out of nature. If I see an animal suffering, I will quite often choose to either save it or put it out of its misery. This could be called intervention in nature, but I don't care, because I think it is a moral thing to do. It promotes empathy and compassion, and I think that is a good thing. It normalizes kindness and caring, and I think that is a good thing. It feeds into building a strong reciprocal system, and I think that is a good thing. Lots of people state that we should keep out of nature, but I don't think that is inherently true, and nobody has proven to me that it is. Sure, we shouldn't destabilize whole ecosystems or anything like that. We also shouldn't exploit nature terribly, but I don't think human intervention in nature is inherently bad or undesirable. I think sometimes it is bad and sometimes it is good. The idea that we shouldn't interfere in nature cannot justify itself without instead changing its position and arguing we sometimes shouldn't interfere with nature. This argument is bad because it doesn't provide any good reason for the sanctity of completely untouched nature. This may be intuitively appealing to some. Many romanticize nature as a beautiful place, and in some regards it is. It is also a very violent cycle of perpetual and almost endless suffering and misery. Intervention in nature can be good or bad. In order to prove it is either, further reasoning is required than simply stating intervention bad. This argument is dumb because it doesn't support itself with anything, and if it did, it would change to sometimes intervention in nature is bad. Sometimes intervention in nature is bad, and that is the nuance that is required. That word, sometimes. I think this argument is bad. Nature is in no way untouchable, and nor should we view it as such. There is no rational reason for doing so. We should interact with nature in moral ways which are beneficial for everyone, and sometimes this will justify leaving nature alone, and sometimes this will justify some amount of intervention into it. This is actually quite an interesting and complicated topic. What extent of human intervention in nature is justified? Do we have any moral obligations to help animals in the cycle of perpetual and endless suffering and torment at the hands of nature that is their existence? I cannot cover this topic and these questions adequately here, but perhaps I will in the future. That concludes our 4 arguments for human opposition to extinction. I think the first 2 concerning biodiversity and the suffering of creatures are very strong arguments. These arguments are the reason I am in strong opposition to the extinction of many species. But what arguments are there for the desirability of extinction? It could be said that existence for an animal in nature is nothing but suffering and misery, a cycle of perpetual pain and torment. Natural selection sees to it that they are forced to live due to an evolved fear of death. They must live, and to live is to exist in a state of misery and suffering. A utilitarian could quite quickly conclude that if an animal's life in nature is almost exclusively suffering and hardship, then extinction is probably a good thing, as it is an end to that torment. This could potentially even justify complete extinction of all sentient life. If the total suffering is worse than the total well-being, and always will be, then perhaps it all just needs to go. This is the lesser evil and the only solution, a utilitarian could say. That isn't what I believe, but I do certainly understand why someone would be inclined towards such a view. I, to be quite honest, haven't come to a conclusive belief on this, but I tend to think humanity is the only species with the capacity to help all creatures. After a mass extinction, life would simply come back. It wouldn't have benevolent, intelligent life as a saviour for many millions of years. Calling humanity benevolent is laughable, given its current and historical relation with animals, but you understand what I mean. We have the capacity for such things, and extinction would just put many millions more years between the endless suffering of creatures and some form of possible salvation. But I will end that tangent before I start sounding completely insane. In some cases, a species going extinct could lead to populations of other species ballooning. This could actually lead to more living creatures and therefore more suffering, at least for a time. This is certainly worth taking into account as a possible consequence. I don't think this argument is generally very good. I think it is interesting and worth considering, but extinction, as I have mentioned, is far from guaranteed to lead to the consequences this argument bases itself upon. I think it is interesting and worth considering, but extinction, as I have mentioned, is far from guaranteed to lead to the consequences this argument bases itself upon the assumption of. Extinction could just lead to more creatures and/or more suffering in various ways. This argument is just not very good and relies on some bad assumptions and sloppy reasoning. It works a lot better as a defense of complete extinction than the extinction of one species. When a species goes extinct, either the ecosystem collapses or another species will likely arise to fill that niche, meaning we most likely get about the same amount of suffering or more out of it. If everything is extinct, then suffering is at least temporarily non-existent. The argument does work better for total extinction, although as I have said, even then its sloppy reasoning lets it down. Life will come back anyway. I think we are intelligent life forms with the capacity to improve things, and any solution lies in us, and by us I don't mean an intentional mass extinction. I mean whatever smart solutions to the suffering of sentience that science, technology, and philosophy may lead us to in the future. Overall, I think animals going extinct generally seems to be quite bad. It damages ecosystems and causes suffering. The arguments I examined here are only a handful. There are likely others that are well worth considering. I think that we all too often fail to engage in moral introspection of issues, and instead just rely on assumptions and intuitionism. I think this is irrational and dangerous, as it can so easily lead us to harmful and undesirable moral conclusions. I hope you found my examination of these issues interesting. If you have any thoughts, I encourage you to leave a comment. On that note, goodbye and have a great day.